Okay, everybody. Competition policy, which we talked about in the last lecture, basically tries to stop firms from colluding with each other, tries to stop them from internalizing the externalities across one another, but just as often we want to promote this sort of collaboration between different individuals or organizations to try to solve externality problems. And in particular, the most extreme form of this is when we have public projects that bring diffuse costs or benefit that are spread across societies in which individual voluntary initiative is insufficient. So I'm going to start, just to link it to our last lecture on competition policy, by talking about Cournot's collaboration problem, which is sort of a dual to Cournot's competition problem, but has the opposite implications. And we're in the Cournot competition problem, we found that as the number of people got large, things started working very well. In Cournot's collaboration problem, as the number of people gets large, things will work very poorly. And we'll talk about the relationship of this to public goods problems. And we'll talk about the definition of public goods and bads, about private solutions to public goods problems and the difficulties that they face, and therefore why it's necessary to use coercion in public goods and bads problems. And as an example of that, we'll talk about eminent domain and the assembly of complementary goods. And then we'll talk about, given that coercion is necessary, how we can go about deciding on whether to apply coercion in a given case or not. And that will lead us into questions of voting and the flaws of standard voting procedures. This will be sort of a downer ending because we'll say that, none of these voting procedures are a particularly good way to solve these problems. And when we come back from break, we'll talk about an alternative procedure that might work better. Okay, so Cournot is one of my sort of heroes. He came up both with the first model of monopoly and the first model of competition. And he also came up with this model of collaboration between firms. So he imagined a case where there were n firms, but rather than producing products that were perfect substitutes for one another, they were ones that were perfect complements. You needed all of the things in order for the product to be valuable. A classic example of this is, I don't know if you guys remember when the Challenger crashed. It was probably before most of you were born. It was before most of you were born. They found that the reason it had blown up was because there was a single O-ring that had failed. O-ring is like something about this size. And so because one O-ring had failed, the whole thing blew apart, right? So that's what... as a classic case of complementary goods, things are only as good as the weakest link, right? And so in this case, the value of the good as a whole is really only the value if you get all of the pieces together, which has a price which is the sum of the prices of the individual components. And demand depends on this sum of prices. Now again, for simplicity, let's assume that each of these goods has constant marginal cost. Then the profits that each firm makes is going to be the price minus their cost times the quantity, which depends on the sum of all the prices. Another way of representing that is that it's their markup, price minus cost, times quantity, which depends on the sum of all the markups plus the sum of all the costs. Okay, so Sue-Ellen, what would be the optimal price for an individual firm to set if they were choosing their price in this market?
Okay, so you take the derivative of that and set it equals 0.
Yeah.
So take the derivative with respect to...
Maybe do this one.
That one?
Yeah, for example.
What's the optimal price? You'd want markups, well...
Maybe you want to do it on the board?
Yeah.
Be easier?
Probably want to.
Yeah.
Okay, so profit is markup times, sorry, quantity of M plus C. So M is the sum of markups and C is the cost. So I guess C is
C is a constant, right?
okay, and M depends on price. So
Well, does that, okay, so how does M depend on price? So M is the sum
M
of
is
everybody's
P by
markup.
minus C by summed up. So that's
Yeah,
so.
and let's say every firm takes all the other firms' prices and therefore markups as given.
Okay, sure. In which case it's I guess it's like your price PI plus the sum of I don't know, like J and equal to I.
Yeah,
P by minus C of I.
yeah,
J, I guess those are J's.
yeah.
So then if I'm just taking the derivative with respect to price. Am I taking the derivative?
Yeah, you take
Okay,
the
yeah,
derivative with respect to
sure,
MI, you're
so-
maximizing, right?
Okay, so
You can do, I mean, because choosing your markup's equivalent to choosing your price, right?
right.
Because
Right,
the cost
this
is
cost
constant, yeah.
constant, right. I'm just, so let's. I'm just gonna call this,
Stuff, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's good.
So take the derivative of that with respect to PI and say that equals 0, you have one, so this term obviously just, so you have a PI times this term, so
Yeah.
that's, I'm gonna have to use a product rule, which is unfortunate. It's- Is that's, I'm just, like I do need to separate those terms?
No, you
Or
don't.
Can I just?
Because you can just treat that whole first term as a term, and you can use the product rule applied to that,
Okay.
right? So what's the derivative of the first term with respect to PI?
Just one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one.
So one times
Q.
So Q of PI plus whatever. That plus the derivative of this, which
Yeah.
PI is just the derivative of this entire thing. So
Yeah,
Q prime of PI plus stuff
yeah,
times the derivative of the inside, which is just one.
yeah.
Times
Times.
this term here,
Yeah.
which is just a markup of I.
So,
Right. And
so now let's solve for the markup of I.
Okay,
Yeah.
right, so markup of I is equal to, so negative Q of PI plus stuff over Q prime of PI
Yeah,
plus stuff. And I guess this can just be written as M plus PI, or M plus C. Will that just make more sense? I mean,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly,
it's just
yeah,
like, okay,
exactly.
so MI is equal to just Q over Q prime.
negative, yeah.
Like, yeah, all right.
Exactly. Nice work, Sue. Okay, and remember that we can get capital M by just summing all these up, right? So capital M is then going to be equal to negative n times q over q prime, right? So note that this is exactly the opposite of the formula we got under competition. Under competition, mi was going to be equal to capital Q over n divided by q prime, because each qi was only 1 over n of the capital Q. Here, it's multiplied by n. So rather than the markup diminishing as n increases, the markup's going to increase as n increases, right? So this is called the double marginalization or multi-marginalization problem. And the more firms you have, the more markup there is. So the basic intuition here is that the firms are all going to take a cut, right? All of them are complementary products, right? Each one is going to demand a markup on their chunk of the product, and all those markups are going to stack up and multiply with the number of firms. So let's consider a simple example. imagine that capital Q is equal to 1 minus P. This is our like linear demand example from before. And CI was equal to 0. Okay, Tanner, what is going to be Q over Q prime in this example?
Well, Q is just 1 minus P.
Yeah.
So 1 minus P over the root of that, which is -1. So
Times negative, yeah.
So yeah, times -1.
So it's just 1 minus P.
-1, yeah.
Yeah, right? Okay, so Suel, what's then going to be the equilibrium price using your formula?
Okay, so PI minus...
So remember we said that capital M is equal to N times this,
Okay.
right? And there's no cost.
Okay, so if capital M is equal to N times N.
Maybe you can do it on the board again.
Okay,
Yeah,
right,
it's probably going to be the easiest.
Okay, so,
So capital M,
okay.
that's or capital P, which is equal to capital M because there's no cost, right?
Oh, okay, all right.
So capital P
Oh, okay.
is equal to N.
This is the sum of all the QIs. Oh, or just this thing times N. Just was it just N times 1 minus P?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So no, but solve that for P.
Oh, okay. So
Yep.
did I do that right?
Yep. Nice job, Suel. So, what that gives us is that the price is equal to N over N plus 1. So, is Dake here? Not seen him. Okay. Does somebody else want to tell me what the quantity is then? Yeah, Mike Galvin.
You substitute the thing that Suel just derived into the equation above, and you get 1 minus N over N plus 1.
What's that? Just make a common denominator.
Okay. N plus 1 minus N over, so 1 over.
1 over N plus 1,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So what happens to this as the number of people gets larger, Suel?
It just goes to 0.
Yeah, exactly. And so eventually, all these people taking their little cut kills the market by the death of 1,000 cuts, right? It's exactly the opposite of the Cournot complements problem. The Cournot competition problem where the price went to the efficient level. Here price is going to the point where it destroys all demand, right? In fact, the formulas are exactly the opposite, right? Because remember that in Cournot competition, I don't know if you guys remember, but the markup was equal to 1 over N plus 1, and the quantity was equal to N over N plus 1. And how they're exactly the reverse for this demand, at least. In fact, these two problems are exactly dual to one another, and I just want to try comparing that. So in the Cournot quantity competition problem, everyone takes each other's quantities as given, and the price depended on the sum of all the quantities, and profits were the product of markup and quantity. Under Cournot's collaboration problem, everyone takes each other's prices as given. The quantity depends on the sum of the prices, and the profits are the product of markup and quantity, right? So the problems are exactly identical except reversed. Therefore, any result that's true in the Cournot competition model is true here but reversed. Firms hurt each other by raising their price rather than hurting each other by raising their quantity, and therefore prices are going to be too high even from the perspective of the firms. So if they could coordinate, if they could collude, if they could merge, they would reduce the price and make everyone better off. Okay. So, mergers between firms producing complementary products, which I think someone brought up in an earlier class, is called a vertical merger. And vertical mergers, the reason they're called vertical is often one way that firms end up being complementary is one firm produces something that they sell to another firm. They then do something with that and they sell it to another firm. So if you draw a diagram of it, they're vertically related rather than horizontally competing with one another. And vertical mergers are usually not considered to be anti-competitive. In fact, there's a reverse version of Cournot's theorem that applies in this context that we've just sort of been going through. And Philip, can you guess what that is?
Let's see, as the number of firms producing perfect complements tends to infinity, quantity tends to 0.
Yeah, and the price tends to whatever price will get no one to buy the good. Absolutely. Yeah, Austin.
Was this like Robert Bork's derivation?
So this was originally derived by Cournot in 1838, but did Robert Bork use this to argue against competition policy at some point? Probably, because every argument that there exists against competition policy, Robert Bork has made at some point. So,
One of the driving forces against getting rid of like vertical integration laws. Yeah.
yes, I mean this is a classic Chicago school argument, and he was part of that broad camp. So I would not be surprised, but I don't know in particular. So markups become individually small, but they collectively kill all demand because there's all these layers of monopoly. You can also think of this as being like a tragedy of the commons problem. Everyone wants their markup, but they don't realize that in the process of getting their markup, they're killing the market that's, the goose that lays the golden egg, right? So let me relate this to an even more famous problem. Imagine that everyone can make costly contributions to a charity, AI, and the value that each person gets depends on the total amount of contributions that are made, which is capital A, which is the sum of AI. And imagine each person's valuation, VI prime, is greater than 0. So then each individual gets a value of this, but the value to society is the sum of that. And imagine that everyone's the same. The contribution that is going to bring total value of this only gives a value of this to each individual. So if they're symmetric, the individuals are going to solve v prime is equal to n, whereas society would set v prime equal to 1. And v prime equal to n, if v is concave, is going to lead to much, much, much lower contributions towards the public good than would be socially optimal. So this gives you basically the same result as Cournot. As n gets large, you're going to be driven down to basically no provision of the good. Because everyone will free ride on other people, their hope that other people will provide the good. And so this is called the collective action problem. In a large population with voluntary contributions, public goods become arbitrarily underprovided. So what exactly do we mean by a public good? This was sort of an example of it, but more broadly, Christian, what's the definition of a public good more broadly?
So I probably won't be able to give a very precise
Yeah.
definition, sorry. But isn't something that would be more like socially optimal for like a central government to produce? Because it's generally a non-rival.
What does that mean? Yeah. That's a good
It
part.
means that you can't really exclude anyone from using it.
No, that's non-excludable.
Wait.
But that's
sorry,
the other part. Yeah,
it's
yeah, the definition.
non-exclusionary and non-rival.
Yes.
Yeah. So you
Yes,
can't
that is the
exclude
definition.
inclusion,
Good.
and non-rival means that like my use of the product doesn't affect yours.
Exactly.
National defense.
Exactly. So non-rival, which I think is the most important part, is that one person benefiting from it does not preclude others from benefiting from it. There's zero marginal cost of supplying it to other people. Non-excludable, which is secondary but still important, is that everyone receives the benefit regardless of whether they're willing to pay or not. There's no way to exclude people or charge them for participation. So examples failing the first condition are called congestible public goods. And examples failing the second condition are called excludable public goods. So intellectual property is actually a good example of an excludable public good because like if you create music, for example, there's really no marginal cost of other people listening to that music. But it is often possible using copyright protections to exclude people from using it, right? Now, in reality, exclusion can be more or less costly. So in the internet age, it's become more and more difficult to actually exclude people from using music, right? And eventually it may become a non-excludable good because it may become just too difficult to stop file sharing. So that's why I think non-rivalry is sort of the more fundamental condition. However, we had a whole lecture on IP, right? And we didn't call that stuff public goods. And I think that the real reason, the real thing that differentiates public goods from IP is usually an example where we think that there is like a genius type person or some entrepreneur who has a vision about what needs to happen in the marketplace, like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs with the iPhone or whatever, or there's some small group of people who have this vision for the broader public. Whereas a public good is something where we think the information about whether it should be created or not, or the most important information, resides not with one individual, but with the broader public. And therefore, it's important that we elicit that information from the public. This resembles, to some extent, the distinction we were making between things that were driven by expertise and externalities and things that were driven more by diffuse information among the public. And as we discussed, almost everything is some mixture of these two. And so these are really two categories into which we put things rather than a completely sharp dividing line. Okay, but using the more traditional definition of public goods, Philip, could you provide some examples of pure public goods?
I suppose we already went over national events, clean air, water, and generally a clean environment is pretty much another pure public good.
Yeah, those are good examples. Environmental services like the air, water, weather. Climate change could affect the weather, and that's sort of a pure public good. The existence value of some goods, charity. Ideas often are very hard to exclude anyone from. They just spread, and everyone benefits from them. Austin.
So is ideas like basic research?
Yeah, I think to a large extent, basic research is basically a public good. Ming, could you give an example of a congestible public good?
Congestible is if it's non-viable.
It's non-exclusive. You can't exclude people, but more people using it does diminish its value.
A bridge? No. Is that people?
Yeah, it depends whether you're able to put guard posts on the bridge and charge people for getting onto it or not.
If people use it, then you get congestion.
Yeah.
The modern also go.
Yeah. So that's a good example. Amenities. Amenities like lakes, parks, things that are hard to keep people out of, but which do get congested. Kim, could you give an example of an excludable public good? That's a good example. Another example would be land reform. So imagine, I don't know if you guys know, but in many developing countries, at least during some periods, there was a group of very wealthy people who owned a lot of land, and they broke up the land and they gave it to the people who were tenants on that land. Now, you could say that that's sort of like a public good because once you've broken up the land, you might as well give it to all the people who are living on it because they know how to farm it better. But of course, you could exclude one of those people from that and kick them off their land. And so that's sort of a excludable public good. Okay. Now, Mike.
Why are those lands not congestible?
Well, the idea is that each piece of land sort of belongs to someone who's been farming it for a long time.
Uh-huh.
So the value that it would give to anyone other than that person is very small.
Okay.
That's sort of the idea.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, Christian.
I have an idea about the ideas. Does that specify specifically non-rival ideas or the feel-good ideas? Because wouldn't there be a lot of ideas that might give you an advantage in a market or some new method or something that's not covered by IP, but
yeah, but there are certainly ideas that go the opposite way, where they're actually anti-rival, right?
if everyone knows it, then you.
Yeah, for example, a lot of pop culture is that way. It depends whether you're a hipster or a preppy. But if you're a preppy, then the more people who know the cultural idea, the better. And if you're a hipster, it is rivalrous, right? The famous. Do you guys know the famous joke about why did the hipster burn his mouth? Because he tasted the soup before it was cool. Or how many hipsters does it take to screw in a light bulb? Anybody know? It's a number you wouldn't have heard of. Many things rather than bringing diffuse harms, rather than bringing diffuse benefits to people, bring diffuse harms. So a classic example of that is land takings. So this is when the government comes in and they're going to build some, new shopping mall or bridge or public work, and they need to take a bunch of land from people, right, in order to build that. And it's only worth taking it if they can get the whole lot of land, right? Because if they only get some subpart, they're not really able to build the project, or not one that's as beneficial. And so that's a public bad, because either you take it from everyone or you take it from no one, right? So it either hurts all the people or none of them. Another example is corporate acquisitions. If someone's coming to buy a corporation, either everyone who currently owns the shares is going to lose their shares, or nobody will, because the person wants to have control over the whole company. Similarly, if you make a settlement on a debt, so where you decide not to take the company into bankruptcy because someone's going to come and buy it out of bankruptcy, well, then everyone has to give up their claims on the company, or nobody does, right? Another example of this is that the Federal Communications Commission has been trying to reassemble parts of the spectrum so that they can be repurposed to do WiMAX. Do you guys know what WiMAX is? It's a system where you can blanket a whole city in Wi-Fi, basically. It's so normal Wi-Fi has a range of 30 feet. This would have a range of miles. And in order to do that, you need to clear out chunks of the electromagnetic spectrum, which has been auctioned off to all these different people. But you need a coherent block. And so you have to either get all of that or none of it, right? Yeah.
Just a quick question on the FCC spectrum. So when they auction off originally, is that for a set period of time?
No, it was ad infinitum.
Oh, so that really sucks.
Yeah. Or it was a 99-year lease or something like that, which is very long relative to the length of the telecoms industry. I mean, after 99 years, we might not even be using the electromagnetic spectrum anymore. Who knows, right? So.
Are there any restrictions on what, when I hypothetically buy it, just do, I don't know, whatever?
No, I don't think there were many restrictions, actually. So I have a paper about this application in particular. Patent pools are another example of this. So remember we talked about the multi-marginalization problem? One case where I think that arises a lot in practice is when there's some technology and there's a bunch of different patents that are necessary to make that technology work. They're all complementary, and people are really scared that if they're all just licensing on their own, it will kill anyone's ability to use the technology, because they're going to have to be negotiating with all these different people. They're all going to take a cut. The price is going to be way too high. So sometimes what they do is they build what's called a patent pool, where they put all these things together and they label them all as what's called standard essential patents. And that forces people to license them at what are called fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory rates, which makes it much easier to license all of the things together to avoid the multi-marginalization problem. But in order to do that, you need to get all the technologies together, which again is going to be one of these things that it's going to take the patent rights away from all the people. Polluting projects are another version of this, where it'll hurt a diffuse set of people, right? Now, fundamentally, these aren't that different from externalities problems, but there are cases where we think that the victim's knowledge about how costly it is to them might be really important. So think about the example of land takings. Someone might know that this land is really valuable to them, that this is where their grandparents grew up. Other people might just be, a yuppie who's happy to take it as long as they get another spot, right? And so this again creates a collective action problem, but now in this reverse case, it's usually called the holdout problem. And the idea is that everyone demands a large payment in order to accept the harm, in the same way that the free riders were making small payments because they didn't want to make a large contribution to the benefit, right? Okay. So these problems are pervasive. They show up in lots of areas of the economy. And I'm going to argue that we need coercion in order to solve these problems in most cases. But before we turn to that, I want to consider some potential private solutions. The most famous one is probably altruism. People often, just out of the goodness of their heart, do public-spirited things like giving to charity, voting, volunteering for military service. And while people choose to do these things, it's not motivated by classic self-interest. Culture plays an important role in encouraging these things. People may want to do it in order to have the prestige. Like, I think that plays an important role in many of the charitable foundations, why Rockefeller and Vanderbilt gave stuff. It also can make you look good to a potential mate. So if you're someone like Bill Gates, who maybe had a hard time in his romantic relationships, it could make you much more attractive if you're seen as being public-spirited. Warm glow can be another important part of this. So this is when people feel good about themselves for doing something, right, regardless of the actual effects that it has on society. Another thing is you might just be signaling. You might be trying to show a potential employer that you're an honest person who cares about society and not someone who's just going to steal from the company, right? And while I think there's no question that these things are important and help, I also think that they often require a slow development of culture in order to embed these values in people, and don't do a very good job responding to exactly in a particular circumstance how much people value something. Because they're all relying on, inside of an individual's head, how much do they think other people will respond to this. Yeah, Rishi?
Generally, when you try to work altruism into a model,
yeah,
you just work like the utility models.
Well, I think that those are usually the least compelling ways of doing it. I think the more compelling ways of doing it are thinking about things like these, where like you might be altruistic, but it's sort of motivated by something else. Or those tend to be the most interesting models I find. But yeah, sometimes you do put it straight into the utility function. Yeah, Bharat.
So for a lot of those examples like are essentially self-interest. So like the slow development of the culture towards like promoting these sort of behaviors. Isn't that also like somewhat perverse? Like you're encouraging attitudes that might not be great.
Well, I mean, culture can be useful to overcome some of these problems. It also can be perverse. I mean, so for example, like around environmental issues, there has developed this view that you really should buy all this green stuff. But if you look at all the green stuff, almost all of it, like nobody would be buying it under the optimal carbon tax because it's actually like way too expensive. And like most of the stuff that people would actually be doing under the optimal carbon tax would be like very minor changes that are extremely not costly to people, and that would account for most of the carbon mitigation. So this stuff can easily go overboard, right? Because in order to like get the public spirit going, so I actually think that, you know, the problem with a lot of these cultural ways of solving these problems is they're just not like very accurate at conveying the relevant information. Like, to address huge, widespread problems that have relatively simple solutions, they can work okay. But they're not all that good at like staying up to date with like what's the way that a price system would be, with like what exactly is the informational conditions and how much should I be doing of this thing exactly. I think it's a little bit like prior to like market exchange with money. People used to have barter systems, or even before barter, they would like do something good for someone else and then someone else would owe something back to them and so forth. But it was very hard in that system to communicate like exactly how much I owed to you, and like to trade with someone who we don't know, and all this sort of stuff, right? And the market system, by formalizing those systems of gift exchange, made things work a lot better. And so I think that's the problem with trying to solve these by these sort of voluntary cooperation. The reason why states have been so important to the development of civilizations is it just gets really complicated trying to keep track of all that stuff without some centralized coercive authority to make all this stuff work. Yeah. Austin.
I remember reading, like, following September 11th,
Yep.
Afghanistan refused to give up Osama bin Laden due to the fact that there's, like, a cultural norm there.
Yeah.
It says, like, you'll never give up a guest, basically,
Yeah.
to their enemy.
Yeah.
And that seems like it's very similar to kind of this, like, strong cultural norms.
Yeah, I mean, of course, laws can also get outdated.
Right.
But I think formal systems generally have proved themselves to allow interactions over broader ranges in more flexible ways than do cultural institutions, though cultural institutions have been crucial in areas where it would be very hard for the law to observe things. So they are important as well, but I think that the more that we're able to take something out of the realm of the cultural and into the realm of the formal, the broader is the possibilities for social development.
I
So
guess I'm just wondering because, like, obviously that turned out pretty badly for Afghanistan.
Yeah.
If there's any kind of, anybody's ever tried to estimate empirically the cost of those types of cultural norms?
yeah, I mean, I think you have to figure out exactly which cultural norms you want to. But yeah, I mean, there's been some work on stuff like that. Like Avner Graef has worked on that. And in fact, we're having him come give a talk in February. So, yeah, Florence.
I'm not sure if you mentioned it later, but how exactly would you define coercion?
That's a very good question. That's an excellent question. So the coercion is an extremely problematic term. The reason why it's a very problematic term is that it's always relative to some status quo that we assume.
Yeah.
What coercion means is we can force people to participate, but the only thing that was making them not participate is that we were protecting their property rights to begin with. But of course, it's not necessarily coercion to take away their property rights, because it could be coercion for them to stop us from taking away their property, right?
Yeah.
So it's all defined relative to some baseline. So I think really, if you look at it from a even higher level of abstraction, there's like an implicit assumption being made that we're sort of in like some property rights regime where people make sort of like linear pricing transactions with one another, and it's coercion relative to that baseline. But I think that one thing that we're going to sort of come to is that like linear pricing with property rights baseline is sort of like not the right way to be thinking about these situations. So in that sense, we need coercion. We really need some fundamental deviation from linear pricing in some sense.
Right.
So, I mean, that's getting to a very, very high level of abstraction, but does that make sense?
Kind of.
Yeah. Okay. So, if public goods and bads are local enough and it's easy for people to move, then people can just move to the place where a lot of public goods are provided well. And this is called taboo competition, where local areas compete to attract people. And I think this is quite important for many local public services such as street cleaning, schools, police, fire, etc. But it depends crucially on people being able to move to the best area cheaply, and in particular on the value of the good to them being independent of their location. So you have to be willing to like move from where you've grown up, where all your friends are, to wherever happens to provide the best public goods, which most people aren't willing to do. And effectively, this makes things both excludable and rival, because in any particular area, those things will tend to get congested, and you can keep someone from moving to the area. So what this says is that, some things that might appear to be public goods maybe aren't that public goods, at least if people aren't too committed to the particular location where they're living. And that what makes something really subject to being public goods is someone is sort of stuck there, or they've got some value of being there in particular, right? So I don't think that this sort of competition is a real solution to the public goods problem, but it does put some bounds on how bad it can get before people will up and leave. Okay. Now the most famous solution to the public goods problem, private solution, came from two Swedes, Erik Lindahl and Knut Wicksell. And they imagined that we were trying to build some big project. Imagine it's just a binary decision, yes or no, are we going to build this project? And I'm going to focus mostly on this case for public goods from now on. And imagine each citizen gets some value VI from the project being built, and the cost of building it is capital C. So the solution they proposed was to ask each person to pay a share SI, which is equal to their share of the total value. And if you do that, then note that if the total value of the project is greater than its cost, that is, it's efficient, then everyone will find the value, their own value, to be greater than their share of the cost. So they proposed a mechanism in which if everyone agrees, then the project gets built. Yeah, Mike.
Sorry, what is capital V?
Oh, sorry, capital V is the sum of all the values.
Okay.
If everyone agrees, then the project is built, and you pay your share of the cost. If anyone disagrees, the project is not built and nobody pays anything. And this should succeed exactly when the thing is efficient, right? Because everyone is pivotal to the decision, and therefore they're all willing to make the contribution because they know that it won't happen otherwise. This is called Lindahl Pricing or equilibrium, or Vixelian unanimity. And in fact, this was the mechanism that was originally the idea that turned into Groupon. So they were trying to fund public goods this way, where there would be some provision point, you would put money in, and only once it got to that point would your money actually be spent, right? And otherwise, it would just keep accumulating, right? Now, in practice, I don't think that this would actually work. And yeah, Tanner.
How is this Groupon?
Okay, so this turned into Groupon. So initially, Groupon's idea was this for some public goods, but then they said, oh well, one public good could be negotiating a coupon with the things. But then, of course, the actual group aspect became irrelevant because once it was just coupons, the companies just didn't care whether they were giving it to a large group or not, right? So, Christian, do you have a question?
This might be a dangerous question.
Yep.
But has anyone tried to fix this problem with a VCG-esque mechanism?
Oh, we're gonna get into that.
Oh.
We'll get into that very soon. Yeah. Okay. So this is probably not practical for a few reasons. Christian, why do you think this? Look up. Why do you think that this wouldn't work in practice?
Well, one thing, you could have the holdout, like you said, the one guy that doesn't want to pay his share. Second of all, it's...
But if we knew exactly what share of the value everyone had, then that wouldn't be a problem, right? Because people would do it if and only if it was efficient,
but
right?
You're assuming that you know the value of the share.
Exactly. That's exactly the biggest problem. And furthermore, this isn't very credible, right? Imagine one person doesn't do it, everybody else does. Wouldn't everyone just then chip in and say, okay, I'll pay a little bit extra just to pay that guy's share, right? More importantly, was the issue Christian raises, that you don't know everyone's value exactly, right? Imagine you only know people's shares approximately. So that there's always some chance that even if it's efficient, their share of the cost is greater than their value, right? Yeah, Bart.
If V is greater than C, then what happens for excess, money raised?
Well, because everyone will get their share of that excess, right? Because they only pay their share of the cost, not their share of the value.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Dave?
Wait, so if their share is significant, you're basically saying that there's a probability that their valuation is lower than their share they'll pay if the...
Yeah, there's some probability just because we don't know perfectly what everyone's share of the total value is. And I think that this is the reason why it's so hard to imagine using this, is that there's always going to be some chance that you misestimated somebody and that person says no genuinely, right? And we can compute what a problem this would cause by crunching some numbers. So imagine that we have capital F being the cumulative distribution function of these values. Imagine everyone has equal shares. So everyone we think is pretty much 1 over n, but there's some uncertainty about that. So then the probability that any individual rejects will be the CDF of C over n, and the probability that any individual consents will be 1 minus f of C over n. So the probability that everyone consents will be 1 minus f of C over n to the nth power. Now imagine that we have such an accurate estimate, and this seems pretty unrealistic, but we have such an accurate estimate of people's valuations that we can make sure there's only 1 chance in 1,000 that they'll reject, right? So even then, once we have 1,000 people, there's only a 35% chance that the thing succeeds. And with a small town, there will be less than a 1 in 20,000 chance that it succeeds. So this shows what happens as the number of citizens grows large. Just the logic of exponentials means that it's very unlikely that this thing is going to succeed. Okay. And that's not simply true of this mechanism where we make people a take it or leave it offer. Like you have to have this fraction of the cost, and you can accept or reject. If you start saying, okay, well maybe some people don't want to do exactly this much, maybe we can allow them to say, well look, I'm willing to pay a little bit less. But if you start doing that, then people have an incentive to free ride, right? Because everyone's going to try to be the one who is the holdout, right? So either way you go, you're sort of damned, right? And this is a fundamental theorem, a lot like Cournot's theorems. It's called the Maloff-Postaway theorem. It says, if everyone must consent to the funding of a project and no external funds are available, the probability of the project being undertaken goes to 0 as n gets large. What that says is that no private, that is voluntary and self-financing system works. And again, to Florence's question, that's voluntary and self-financing relative to the set of things that we've sort of endowed to people before we do this project, right? So thus we always run in, Barrett.
How is that related to voting? Like, I believe there's, like,
We're going to talk a lot about voting in just a second, so let me just get there. Okay, so thus we always run into a collective action problem. Public projects, good or bad, always require collusion. And we did it for a binary case, but it's true more broadly. And coercion can operate really in 2 ways that are quite closely related. Suel, what are those 2 ways that it can operate? So we defined private as voluntary and self-financing. So what are the 2 ways we could break that?
Non-voluntary will just force people to do something.
Yeah.
You force them to pay for something.
Yeah. And what form of coercion could break self-financing?
Like government coercion.
If you had some money from the outside, right, which would have to come from somewhere, presumably from making somebody else pay for it, right? Yeah. So you can make the members of the... Yeah, Evan.
What do you mean by making members of the community consent?
Well, you can force them to pay, right? You can use the coercive power of the government.
Oh, like taxing them?
Well, or in the case, or implicitly taxing them, like forcing them off their land, right? Or you can raise some external funds, but of course, unless that's voluntary, it has to come from someone. So in some sense, they're both coercive strategies, right? So in eminent domain, in eminent domain, how would this work in practice, Evan?
In eminent domain, you have the government that wants to do some kind of project. And so it takes a valuation of whatever it is they want to take, usually land.
Yeah.
And they go and make a price, or they offer the price of whoever it is. They can either choose to accept it, or a lot of times people will actually go to court to try and extract a higher price.
Yeah, so the government but the government has the right of eminent domain to force people off their land, right?
Yes, but it also has to be considered, like, by law, a fair price, or else it's cruel and unusual punishment in the United States.
Well, it's not cruel and unusual punishment, but it's not just compensation.
Well, I think that I think there is a law that has to be considered a fair price. It
Yeah,
can't be
yeah,
1 cent.
it's called just compensation.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, that's the constitutional
yeah,
provision.
If it's ruled a fair price, you have to accept it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one thing, is that they can tax some of the beneficiaries of the public in the eminent domain situation, and then they can use that to subsidize this fair price. Or they can just force people off of their land, and the Supreme Court has really expanded this so that you can do this in a very wide range of cases. Similarly, in debt and corporate restructuring, there's usually some sort of voting where you can force people who don't want to sell their things to sell them. Okay. So, what this has taught us is that we need to use some form of coercion in order to address these problems. But, of course, when we use coercion, we don't any longer have the market's magic decision-making mechanism guiding the decision that we make, because there's going to have to be some central coercive authority that makes the decision. For example, when is it worth building the project or kicking people off their land, etc. And this is a very similar problem to the externalities discussion we had before. And what ways did we talk about then making a decision about whether to impose a particular externalities tax? Evan, what were some of the procedures that we talked about then?
So we had things like contingent valuation.
Yeah.
Gross mechanism.
Yeah.
There was another one.
Yeah, that's good. Expertise, having experts assess it. Yeah.
Analysis.
So, exactly. And these are used with sort of declining frequency. Often it's assessed by experts. Sometimes they use these crazy surveys. And then the mechanisms that Christian was referring to are almost never used, right? Now, I think the key difference here, if there is any, is that we are focusing on a case where there's like some binary decision to be made, whereas there we were more focusing on like how high the tax should be. And we think it's really important to get input from individuals, so we don't think that the expertise is going to be sufficient in most cases. And there's a very large number of individuals involved. Now, in these settings in practice, we often use some form of voting to make the decision. In particular, everyone gets some weight, and the thing is approved if people's support is above some threshold. Okay. So let's think about how voting is as a way to make decisions on these issues. So imagine that everybody has even shares again and has those IID values we talked about. Now, we want the thing to pass if the sum of all the values is greater than the cost, which is to say if the average value is greater than the per person cost, right? But when is it going to pass under voting? Can somebody tell me? Yes, Sue.
Like a majority of people have their value over the average value.
Yeah, so can you express that in some statistic being greater than the per person cost?
It's like n over 2 times b bar is greater than c over 2.
Okay, so if the majority has their values be above that, what will that say about how the sum statistic compares to the per person?
So like, would that include the CDF?
Yeah, it's related to that.
So I guess, yeah, I'm sorry.
Anybody else? Yeah, Adam?
It would be the median.
Exactly. So if the majority have VI greater than C over N, this is the same as the median person having something that's above that, right? So this is going to be efficient if and only if the median person has the same preferences as the mean person. And a sufficient condition for this is that there's a symmetric distribution of valuations. But even in when there's a large population, in a finite population, that's not even enough. So Ted Bergstrom in 1979 used this to argue for an interesting tax principle. He said that it's probably not likely that the median person has the same value as the mean person, because rich people tend to value public goods more they value having nice streets in dollar terms more. And we know that the distribution of income is not symmetric, it's skewed to the right. But imagine that we have people pay taxes that are proportional to their income. Then it might be that their valuation as a fraction of their income might be closer to being symmetric. And so democracy might work better if things are funded out of taxation that's proportional to income rather than out of a flat tax that everybody pays, which I think is an interesting argument. Yeah, Maury?
Why wouldn't it be efficient if the median were greater than the mean?
It wouldn't be efficient because imagine that the mean were less than C over N, and then the median were greater than C over N, then you would build it even though it's not efficient.
Oh, okay.
So it's just like to generally be efficient, it requires that. Okay. So a sort of more broad principle of taxation is that if you can tax people in a way that sort of organizes it so that we know what part of the distribution corresponds to the mean conditional on the taxation, then things are going to work better because you could always set the voting threshold so that it's exactly equal to whatever part corresponds to the mean. So for example, if you know that the distribution is right skewed, you could have a sub-majority rule for approving the thing so that you don't need a full majority. If it's left skewed, you could have a super-majority rule in order to get something that's more efficient. But again, you need to know what quantile of the distribution corresponds to the mean in order to do that. Yeah, Kristen.
I have a question, and it relates to filibusters.
Yeah?
So would that mean that filibusters would be more efficient if you have a more extreme wing of one party?
Yeah, so if filibusters are a more efficient mechanism, then, and sometimes submajority rule, right? So you want to have on positive votes filibuster if the people who feel intensely are opposed. And you want to have submajority rule if they're in favor.
Okay.
You see what I mean? So here's a simple example of it. Like gay marriage, right? So gay marriage is an issue where it's very clear that there's a very small part of the population that's tremendously affected by this issue and that's in favor of gay marriage, and another part of the population that doesn't care as much but might be in favor of or against. So it seems very clear to me on gay marriage that we should have not majority rule, but sub-majority rule to pass it, or supermajority rule to stop it. You see what I mean? Because only if the rest of the population is overwhelmingly against it should we overrule the preferences of that minority who we know feels very strongly about it. Okay, so in addition to this sort of general problem that there can be the tyranny of the majority under majority rule, this can also create particular perversities when people have the ability to manipulate how much value people get out of the issue. So let me give you an example. Imagine that we are the government, or maybe a private person who's in league with the government, and we want to buy out some land. And imagine that we're going to make an offer for this land, and then we're going to have a majority vote among the people whose land is being taken about whether they want to accept the offer or not. And then everyone's going to be forced to go along with that. If you were the developer, Adam, what strategy would you follow in order to get the land for the lowest possible price?
Well, if it's like a 51% majority rule, then you just offer just enough to get to that 51% of people would support it, and then
in particular, you would target all of your offer you'd identify 51% of poor people who'd be willing to sell for a little bit, right? You would give them all just enough to get them to sell, and then you'd offer nothing to everybody else. And so then you would have stolen at least 49% of the land, probably more, right? Yeah. So that can lead to inefficient expropriation and underinvestment. In fact, in general, and this is the example Christian was giving, democratic governments are known to be prone to populism, which is basically when you find something that like benefits like a majority of people in the relevant place, and then you screw everybody else, right? Even though they're benefiting less than everybody else is losing, right? There are tons of other examples of this tyranny of the majority problem, so that are more severe than the Iowa caucuses. So one of them is you can get just 51% of a company, and then you could like just sell the whole, instruct the company to be sold to a shell company that you control, right? We talked about that in the Theory of the Firm lecture. Populist governments in Latin America do all sorts of things that maybe benefit the majority but screw over the rest of the population and ruin the economy. Majoritarian governments in the Middle East have recently, as people have probably noticed, been doing things that like really hurt minorities in those areas. So like the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt was, doing all sorts of things to oppress religious minorities, which led to all sorts of instability. A simple example is that in Doodle, I don't know if anyone's ever used Doodle for scheduling, but like it's very easy for people to like, only check the one date that they most want to do, and then maybe a bare majority does that, and then there's all sorts of people who can't make that date at all who don't get included, right? Gay marriage referenda, etc., right? So to fix many of these problems in practice, we don't actually use majority rule, right? What we use is some combination of majority rule with all sorts of informal institutions like log rolling, like I scratch your back, you scratch mine, lobbying, the Supreme Court tries to protect minorities, there's like checks and balances that create supermajority rules, etc. So we have all these we've got democracy and we're like, oh, that's a great idea. Well, actually, maybe not such a great idea. Let's put all these bandages around it in various ways, right? And the problem with all of these fixes is even though maybe they're better than just simple majority rule, because it would be overwhelmed by the tyranny of the majority, they lead to all sorts of inefficiencies and corruption and paralysis, as we've noticed in Congress recently. Yeah, Philip.
Do you have any evidence that log rolling and lobbying actually fix more problems than they create?
No. But I think they do, probably. Because I think that if you look at the movie Lincoln, the 13th Amendment I don't think would have passed without that sort of corruption. And I think that for every example that you have of some bad corruption, you see, actually I do have one sort of example. They got rid of earmarks in Congress a few years ago, and I think Congress has turned into much worse of a disaster since they got rid of them. So I think that's one example. Yeah, Dave.
Does this also tie back to our earlier discussion about when you have, because entities that are lobbying tend to have more income, I suppose you could say, they get higher valuation out of decisions, that they're more impacted by decisions.
Yeah,
voting.
But on the other hand, that leads them to get all the influence. If you just turn it over to a lobbying system where it just can be bought out, well then that's not very efficient either. It's just then the person who values it the most wins it. So that's not a very good system either.
So it's kind of like filibuster.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
How is it related to the late post-World War? There's a probability that it's efficient higher if there are more people voting?
No. Voting is pretty invariant to that. Because the thing is, mail-off postal vote really comes out of the absence of coercion, not out of the inefficiencies associated with voting. So voting is one potential solution to that, but it has its own inefficiencies associated with it. Good question, though. Yeah, Dave.
With voting, isn't there also the problem that there's a transaction cost to the actual act of voting itself? And so that might filter out people who don't care that much about the decision, or might feel they might care about the decision.
So that can actually improve things, but there's a whole culture around voting in democracy, which I think encourages people not to take those votes, those costs into account, and to vote just because it's their obligation to vote. Because the mechanism is not really vote if and only if it's above the transactions cost to you. The real mechanism is everyone should vote. And even though you're not literally required to, and transaction costs do filter out some people, and maybe that can make it a little bit better actually, that's not sort of what people want. You know what I mean?
It's better because that means that the median person is close, it tends to be
Closer to the
more
mean.
close to the mean.
Yeah, probably. At least in some cases. Yeah, Christian.
Isn't there actually like a paradox named after some old dead guy, like the voting paradox, that like in a large enough society, the actual benefit of your vote is basically zero?
Yeah.
And so since voting does have some transactional costs, no one should be voting?
Yeah, that's true. There's a whole lot of literature about that question.
Whose was that? Do you remember that?
Well, I mean, it's a very old idea. I think Condorcet first pointed that out. But there's a lot of recent literature. There's a book by Mark Blyce that's pretty good on this. If you're interested in it.